The most important thing is, have I disseminated my voice to the back of the hall? Can you hear me at the back of the hall? Yes or no? Yes? Can you hear me at the back of the hall? Excellent. I'm going to disseminate my information to the back and say, please come to the front so that you are part of this group. I want us all to sit together. This is a really important session that we're having. It's about getting ideas from where they generate to other markets and to other kinds of transport sector. In order to do this, so that we can all speak to each other, we need these little babies. So everybody, please get your headsets ready, because we're going to speak in the language we feel most comfortable in. Let me introduce our very eminent panel to you. We have, from Russia, Transport Minister Igor Levitin. He is Mr. Railways in Russia. Welcome, sir. There's Mr. Levitin in the corner. Let me tell you that President Putin, when he was president, gave Mr. Levitin a special medal to recognize his services to the railway industry in Russia. We have from China, Vice Minister Wang. Welcome.
Thank you.
Vice Minister Wang is a ports and harbor specialist. All your questions in this area, please put them to Vice Minister Wang. Not just in China, he's also lived and worked in Mexico and can give you an insight into what it's like, really, to see South-South cooperation. Welcome. From the private sector, we have Klaus Bauer from Bombardier Transport, massive railway infrastructure group working in many countries, including a lot of work in China. Welcome, Mr. Bauer. Also from Germany, we have Karsten Kirschmann from Toll Collect. Now, this is a big innovation. At the moment, it's really pretty well based in Germany. How do you get new technology into trucks so that they don't have to go through all those barriers? Can Mr. Karsten Kirschmann manage to get it across Europe? This is a question to ask him. Thank you for joining us. Also from the world of industry, we have Rafael Gallego from Spain. Indra, an IT background is what he has, and he's really focusing on air traffic control systems. Yes, a very topical subject. I'm sure you have a lot of questions for Mr. Gallego. Who have I left out? George Dragnich, International Labour Organization. Is labour a drag when it comes to innovations? What can we do to make sure that we bring everyone together when moving into the future? And last but not least, certainly not, Marc Jouel from the World Bank, World Bank's Transport Supremo. Really, if you don't have the World Bank on your side and you are a third world country struggling, well, you need to persuade him. So here's what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to try and have a free-flowing discussion between the panel and between me and the panel. People can interrupt each other if they want. We want it to be very relaxed for part of the time. But hey, we've got a big audience here. I want to give you the second half of our time together so that you can ask questions of our eminent panelists. So listen carefully. Your time will come. We would like you to actively participate in this session. And my first question is to Minister Levitin, who's joined us from Russia. Minister, may I ask you this? How do we manage to get innovations to disseminate? What do you think are the most important things to make sure that ideas do not get stuck where they are generated, but go round the world, including to Russia?
Спасибо за вопрос. Я считаю, что нужны очень хорошие информационные коммуникации. Приведу пример. Российская Федерация до недавнего времени пользовалась системой, глобальной навигационной системой GPS. В этом году в России работает система глобальной навигации ГЛОНАСС. Без этой системы, я считаю, GPS, ГЛОНАСС, будет Галилео, неважно, но без хороших навигационных систем и информационных технологий транспорта нет будущего. Потому что информация о транспортных средствах должна поступать раньше, чем транспорт прибудет к месту назначения. Это нужно для пересечения границ между нашими странами. Это нужно для логистики. И это нужно для коммуникации между транспортными компаниями. Поэтому я считаю, инновации прежде всего – это информационные технологии и навигационные системы.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for a brief intervention as your first one, Minister Levitin. So transport is not so much the issue, but really information and making sure that people connect better. Vice Minister Wang, I'd like to bring you in at this stage. Can I ask you about something in particular? Okay, China, we know, has made massive, massive investments in the whole area of infrastructure, leading the way in many ways. Let's just look at your area of ports, for instance. I don't know if you know in the audience, but the 6 of the top 10 ports in the world, 6 out of the top 10 are in China. So there has been a huge investment in this area. But China hasn't done it on its own. It's brought in supply, knowledge, ideas from the outside world with global suppliers, DP World, for instance. Can you tell us what has been your experience with these public-private partnerships, bringing in ideas from the outside world and benefiting from them in China?
Uh, 谢谢你，你这个问题提得很好。这个确实如此，中国现在交通基础设施的投资的规模量都是非常之大，但是呢，我觉得更多的给中国交通发展带来活力的，还不仅仅在投资，而是在创新啊。因为中国港口的发展，首先起步于我们和一些发达国家、先进国家的合作和交流。所以现在我们可以自豪地说，中国的港口业无论是管理水平，它的能力都是进入了世界的先进水平。其原因就是我们是在这种交流融合过程当中，再加上我们自主的创新，促进了我们港口业的发展。这就是我要告诉大家的。谢谢。
Okay, so Vice Minister Wang, I want to ask you right away, what kind of benefits have you had from, for instance, DP World working in China? In particular, what are you in China getting out of using a big global supplier? Why do you need a global supplier?
首先我想介绍的就是，因为中国的港口业在过去，它的装卸水平、运行效率都是非常低的。这主要来自2个方面，一个是由于投入不错，基础设施不行；再一个就是管理上的落后。但是现在光有基础设施的改进还不行，还有管理理念、一些运行技术的提高。你比如举个最简单的例子，过去的集装箱，我们都是单向运作，但是呢，这个前些年 中国的港口机械业中华港机就发明了就是2箱一起吊的技术，这样就大大提高了整个港口的装卸能力。我想这种效率收益给的是船方啊，给社会各界。谢谢你。
Well, that's a great example. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that we'll have lots more of those real concrete examples to show us which are the best ideas, what's worked and what has not worked. Who should I turn to next? I know who, Carsten Kirschman from Toll Collect. I wanted to ask you about public-private partnership, because Toll Collect would not have happened without a massive investment by the German government. Tell us a little bit about your business, for those who don't understand it, and then about the kind of nature of negotiating with the government, really, and making sure you can make a private sector success in such an environment.
Let me make 2-3 points. First, just to set the records correctly, the German government didn't invest a penny prior to the first day of operation of the system. So it was full financing, pre-financed by investors, actually the shareholders of Toll Collect. Just to put that record straight for the sake of arguments. Secondly, I'm looking to my French colleague here. France has a great history in highway systems, private investments through the private sector. They have a history of 40 years. Germany has a history for high-rise buildings, for building sectors to privatize, PPP, public-private partnerships. We have been, or we are, the first real major PPP, public-private partnership in this sector, which deals with one topic, to put an accounting system on a running, existing 12,500 kilometer highway system. And this means a learning curve. This meant a learning curve for me to deal with, I have one customer actually. I have the German Ministry of Transport. So how do we handle this?
So let me jump in there then. Learning curve means that some things go wrong, yes? Mistakes are made. What have you learned? What did you wish you knew at the beginning of this process?
I came in October 2003. And my learning curve had to be, coming out of the normal economy, the decision-making processes run differently with the customer you have. Their decision process you have to handle, you have to honor. I think other colleagues will share their opinions there. But my personal judgment, we haven't had this experience of 40 years dealing in such partnership. We have to learn this. Perhaps we learned it the hard way. The other side, the government, also has to do this learning curve, my opinion. And put it that way, you don't hear anything from us anymore. We're doing it pretty well nowadays.
Well, you know why? Part of the reason that Mr. Kirschman is a little bit sensitive on this is that there is actually a dispute going on with the German government at the moment. So I can't ask him too many questions because the lawyers won't let him answer, I suspect. So we hear a lot about public-private partnerships, but they are not necessarily going to be easygoing, are they? Mark Juel from the World Bank. I mean, what do we do in countries where you've got, say, the government is not in such a powerful position as maybe the German government was, a smaller government, a poorer government in the middle of Africa or in the middle of South America, and it's the private sector company coming in which has actually got the power, which is is calling the shots. How do you make sure it's fair?
Well, first I'd like just to recall a speech recently given by Bob Zelig, president of the World Bank, during the last spring meetings, and leading into this discussion. What he said basically was that we should now move away from the traditional paradigm, first world, second world, third world, that we are now in a situation where there is a multipolar world, really, for economy, for environment. And the traditional differentiation really don't apply anymore. And so when we look at those innovation debates, and specifically your point, PPPs, okay. Clearly the World Bank has been promoting, mobilizing the resources of the private sector to help developing countries overcome obstacles, to help muster more resources, raise additional funds to develop their infrastructure. But yes, indeed, the point you make is quite valid. In many developing countries, especially the ones which are, let's say, the low tier, who are really a lot to do in order to catch up with this globalized economy. When a big multinational comes in to negotiate a PPP, let's say for a motorway or for a port, actually I used to be a port engineer, Mr. Minister, so I'm quite sympathetic to your view there. Well, typically you find a very well-equipped private sector party with lawyers, financial experts, and a government which so far has not been used, and sometimes not used at all, to deal with such a partner. And what the bank does and what the other development banks do in this, when we are called upon to help, is facilitating this process first by providing technical assistance or financing assistance, specialized lawyers, financial experts to the government, also paving the way for a better negotiation by helping with some reform process, hopefully a bit sometime ahead of the negotiation itself, so that we help level the field, so to speak, between the government and the private players, so that there is a win-win. I mean, win-win is, everybody wants a win-win situation, but if we don't try to channel the process somehow, it's unlikely that it's always a win-win. So that's the kind of assistance we bring to help rebalance a bit the forces.
So can I ask you this then, Marc Joël? We just heard from Carsten Kirschmann that it's a learning curve, really, when you have relationships between governments and the private sector. Both are sometimes having to learn from how to go about doing this. You are in the position at the World Bank of having been involved in many such endeavors and many such interactions. What are the lessons then that you can learn, the positive lessons that you can learn for when it's worked, that you can then move into other countries? And can you give us a real example of a place where you think, okay, it really worked in XYZ country, and now we must try and make sure that we use that model over and over again to help disseminate innovation?
Well, first, I mean, the key word is balance, I would say. And in those PPP, and that it's easy to forget that for this to work, you really need to reach a balanced relationship between the public and the private sector. And it's easier said than done, really. And of course, the first thing which may happen in countries which choose to have a very strong administration, well, when these countries typically went into the PPP process, let's say 10, 15 years ago, there was a temptation for the government to ask a lot from the private sector and actually to give very little in terms of freedom of operation, typically. So that led to some unbalanced contracts, and some of them were signed at the time, which unavoidably led to some litigation further down the line because it was unbalanced, and in this case, unbalanced towards the public sector. Now, you had many other situations which was the reverse, basically governments eager to rush into these new PPP protocols, hoping indeed to get additional resources, but not being well equipped to negotiate, and negotiating deals which were actually unbalanced toward the private sector. Well, this had actually two series of consequences which even the private sector suffered from. First, in the first one, is that typically when it was about ports, motorways, railways, if the PPP was unbalanced, it meant that the benefits which were expected actually didn't materialize the way they were supposed to be. They were supposed to materialize. But second, and to some extent, it was a bit of a paradox. The private operators found themselves a bit in a bind when they realized that they were dealing with a counterpart on the administrative side which was too weak to take the decisions they needed to be taken. A famous example of that was in Argentina, when in 1995 the Argentinian actually concessioned out in the town of Buenos Aires 5 container terminals in the old port of Buenos Aires. This was done, and it was done pretty effectively, actually, on a competitive basis. But one thing which was missing was the public part of the P, because the government did set up a national port authority, but left it very weak without endowing it with the powers and the responsibilities that it needed to have. The contracts were signed between each of the operators and the Ministry of Transport directly. But when just a few years down the line, questions came about development, extension of those container terminals, decisions had to be taken about land use. Municipality had to be involved. The Ministry of Transport was not equipped to deal with those kind of things, and the private operators were left hanging there without anybody able to take decisions, and that had very direct consequences on their capacity to invest and expand.
So that was a great example, Mark. Thank you very much.
Is important.
Balance, making sure that it's fair, really, on both sides. I want to move on very soon to talk about this issue of standards, global standards, Europe-wide standards, to see if that's a way of disseminating innovation more effectively. But before I do so, I just want to see if anybody on the panel wants to add their voice to what we've just been discussing, which is public-private partnerships. What has been your experience, what has worked and what has not worked? Does anyone want to say anything on that before I move on? Karsten.
Just looking to the governmental side, I think it's key, whatever you do, whatever interest you have, to clearly define the goals you want to achieve. I take the example of toll collect. When the German government, mid-90s, made a decision to have such a tolling system, they had not only one objective, the funding, the financing of the future of highways, of networks, of roads. They also had environmental aspects behind it and traffic management aspects. And on that basis, they prepared a tender. A very detailed, accurate tender. And as Mark said, they got themselves the support they needed to set up a framework where they could say, okay, that's the Bible I'm betting upon. And now I'm looking for someone. So what I'm saying is the accurate homework has to be done first. Because when you're not clear about the objective, why you are doing a certain thing, you might be lost in the process in the end.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you very much. So let's move on to another subject, which is standards. To what extent will it be the case that if you have uniform standards, let's say in the railway industry, where at the moment you have a multiplicity of different standards, or air traffic control, which I think there's something like 26 different authorities just in Europe? It's extraordinary. I may have the numbers wrong, but there are many, many different standards. To what extent, if we manage somehow to sit together and hammer out common standards, will it be easier then to move innovations when they take place in one market, say high-speed trains in China, move them to other markets more easily so that they get to Russia? This is just an example out of thin air. I'm going to ask Klaus Bauer to talk to us about this, Management Board Chairman of Bombardier Transportation and a big rail rolling stock manufacturer.
Yeah, railway is a very traditional business. At the moment in Germany, we are celebrating 175 years of railway. And if you go to the different countries in the world, you see different standards all over. And that is very difficult for the railway industry to create standards, to produce the same kind of trains in every country. And it's very important that we really work on standardizing our norms all over the world. If possible, we are now trying it, for example.
Klaus, I'm going to interrupt you. Give us an example of what you mean. All sorts of different things don't talk to each other.
Well, I have an easy example. If you take the gauge of the railway in Europe, we are more or less the same, except Portugal and except Russia. We have different gauges. That means we cannot run over the borders because we have to change the gauge. And that is one of the big issues. There is one example which the Deutsche Bahn has tried to run a train from Germany to China. And it took, I think, about 17 days or something like that, because there were a lot of changes, a lot of borders to overcome. And if we would have common standards, it would be much easier to run on these distances. And it would be very useful for transport of freight. You can do it faster than the ships, but you cannot do it as fast as the aeroplanes. But it would at least be a new mode of transport to these countries.
What do you think, Minister Levitin? Do you think this is realistic, what Klaus Bauer has just said, that we can have Europe-wide, maybe even global standards, common standards in the railway industry?
Ну, я считаю, что разное расстояние колеи не влияет на единство стандартов. У нас есть проблемы более глубокие. У нас нет единого транспортного документа в странах Европы, России и Китая. То есть грузоотправитель в Китае отправляет по одному транспортному документу. Мы в России должны его переделать, а Европа его еще раз переделает. Поэтому вопросы очень важные, но давайте пример такой возьмем. Вот Bombardier, Siemens и другие компании, когда приходят в Россию, у нас есть такой стандарт. Пассажирские вагоны должны, и грузовые тоже, выдерживать температуру минус 60 градусов. А таких стандартов нет в Европе. И эти компании не могут участвовать в конкурсе на российском рынке. И есть такие вопросы, которые мы должны решать глобально. Или, например, Евросоюз принял решение с 2012 года брать квоты по СО2 на воздушном транспорте. Россия, Китай, США не поддержали. Международная организация ИКАО не поддержала. То есть мы создаем региональные стандарты, вместо того, чтобы договариваться и делать их глобальными и одинаковые, понятные для всех. Получается, что самолет из Юго-Восточной Азии пролетает в Европу или в Америку и пользуется различными стандартами и квотами по выбросу СО2. Поэтому вопрос важен, и мне кажется, что именно на таких форумах мы должны ставить эти вопросы. Спасибо.
So what you're saying, Minister Levitin, then, is this is about politics. It's about people agreeing with each other, coming together in forums and hammering out agreements that work. And it's not in a way about the idea and the innovation. Because if we can come up with some common agreement, then the innovation will flow. What you were saying about the documentation, for instance, between the freight going to China or to Europe, this is something that people could sit down and agree if they really wanted to, yes. And that would be a huge innovation, but it's not about technology at all, is it?
Я считаю, инновации должны приниматься на одинаковых стандартах. Если у нас нет одинаковых стандартов, то подход к инновациям будет разный. И это связанные вопросы. Поэтому мне кажется, что прежде чем переходить к глобальным инновационным системам, мы должны стандарты и режимы свои согласовать для своих глобальных перевозчиков.
Okay, very strong statement there from Minister Levitin, but how difficult is it to achieve because of the different interests of different countries? Let's take another look at this very issue of standards in a different industry, air traffic control. Now, this is something that Rafael Gallego knows a great deal about from the IT perspective. It has been so difficult to try and establish common standards. We know this. The ash cloud has brought it to everyone's attention. You may never have thought about this before. You'll know about it now. Can you give us your perspective as to why it is that it's been so hard?
Okay. I represent here one information technology companies, and I would like to use this opportunity to underline the very important role of the IT in this creation of standards. Creation of standards in general is a very complex process, and it takes time and energies. But what really facilitate the creation of standards is the real implementation of common technology between different, in this case, of the air traffic control that you have mentioned, is having common technologies between different services providers. I would like to emphasize that the situation in Europe is a clear example of that. There are countries that agree to share common technology, and this decision adopted by key users, key services provider, is a factor that is really facilitating the research and development and the future implementation of the single European sky. So I would like to emphasize the extreme importance of the technology in the creation of such standards.
But the single European sky is a very long-term project, yes, and a massively expensive project. It seems to us, what is another 15 years to go? We have problems now, today. How are we going to get there and deliver? The IT is leaping way ahead of the standards, is what I'm saying, isn't it?
The countries and the technological partners like us, we are conscious of this problem that the single European sky cannot wait until the year 2020, and for that reason there are interim programs and ongoing programs that are totally aligned with the objectives of the single European sky and will be in service earlier than the real implementation. So single European sky is not a big bang process; is a step-by-step process.
Okay. I'm going to bring in George Dragnich in a minute to ask him about the human factor. You know, unions are often seen as a drag on innovation and change. I want to hear what he has to say about that. Before I ask George to come in, though, is there anybody else who wants to throw in a comment, an intervention at this stage about standards, the importance of standards, how we facilitate this difficult process of hammering out common standards? Klaus Bauer?
Yes, I think Minister Levitin has touched a very important point. Innovation is not only technologically driven, it's driven by politics, it's driven by commercial issues, and it's also driven by bureaucracy. So we need all levels to be involved to really move forward. It shows also in the single sky in Europe, it shows also in a common European network. We need to overcome more than just the technological issues.
Please, jump in.
We have one great example we nowadays use every day, standardization, this one. Mobile telephone. Who would have believed in the mid of the 80s that you would be able to have a phone wherever you are in the world and would be reachable? GSM standardization is the key word.
Okay,
it's a great example how things could work. On the other hand, please, final argument, we should be cautious. With standardization, easily could come the topic of bureaucracy. What is the right level of standardization? Where don't you kill off the innovative mode? So you have to find also the right level, how far you would go to standardize, not to kill industry, public sector, or whomsoever, to really go and innovate.
So just as you were talking about the phone, this gentleman's phone has gone. I'm going to ask everybody else, please make sure your phones are on silent mode. But is transport different from a consumer good like a phone? Because, after all, the sheer amount of money that goes into the infrastructure, the national interest, the involvement of governments in providing so much of the infrastructure, the public-private nature of so many transport projects, which you don't have for phones, after all, does that mean that it's much harder to achieve standards? Does anyone want to answer? Maybe Vice Minister Wang?
首先我的观点认为，创新的动力不在标准，创新的标准是来自于原动力，应该来自于其他的利益。但是标准，好的标准确实能够激发创新。相反，制定的不好的标准，它会遏制标准，遏制创新。这种例子很多。我想这里我简单举一个例子，比如集装箱技术。集装箱技术给运输上是带来革命性的变化。原因是什么？这一标准，它能使众多的利益通过这种运输方式得以实现、体现，所以为大家所拥护。所以这种标准就大大地促进了创新，以后的各种运输革命和其他的标准的引申。 当然，不好的标准有很多，我在这里不一一列举。
Great point, and you've taken me very nicely, Minister Wang, onto George Dragnish, because after all, innovation doesn't start with standards. It starts with people, doesn't it? Someone, somewhere, came up with the idea for the container ship. In fact, I've got his name here somewhere. What is his name? Yes, exactly. Somebody has to dream this up. Someone in their back garden has to come up with the innovation in the first place. What is the human factor, George Dragnish, in making sure that innovations get out from this person's idea?
Well, thanks for that, Nisha, because that's exactly what it is. The human factor is a subsystem of the larger system. It's just one of many. Minister Wang gave us an example of the people factor, but earlier he spoke of the maximal use of the Chinese ports came about when they changed their management practices. Likewise, you would see it in the example that Professor Bide gave us this morning in terms of the seminal technological innovation of 150 years ago, which was the railway. These became ubiquitous but dangerous, and it was only when they made the management changes of staff and line, which was actually a personnel issue, that they were able to address the safety issue. Likewise, we'll see that in the single European sky, of which various speakers spoke today, and Mr. Gallego as well. In fact, Nisha, it's 67 different units within Europe, 38 countries, which they hope to get down to about 14. There'll be the single European sky, and there'll be an North American equivalent called Next Generation. And what we saw, of course, with the ash cloud was the prescience of the OECD in moving what had been a European transportation ministers forum into a global forum, because we all suffered from the failure to have a European rationalized system. We would argue at the ILO that some of the best innovations come out of the workforce, and that you really need to engage the people who are using your systems in their design and in their upgrades and the new technology.
But isn't it just as well the case, George, that some of the great blocks and the obstacles to innovation also come from the workforce? We know about the airline strikes that are going on across Europe at the moment, and in India too, where I come from. How do you take people along with you to change? How do you make sure that people are not scared of change?
Well, that's certainly the case, and a very legitimate one, very legitimate question. You do so by involving them in the early stages of the process. In a workforce, where especially one that's unionized, you identify people in that workforce who can be champions of change, who can be change leaders, and you cultivate those people. It's where you...
Give me an example of that. I mean, it sounds great in theory, George, but what does that mean, champions of change? How do you go about doing that?
Well, for example, let me take the example of the air traffic controllers, because you raised that one. IFATCA, which is the International Federation of Air Traffic Control Associations, has repeatedly argued for the rationalization of the European system. That's not what you read in the newspaper. You read in every single article I've read, from the FT to the Wall Street Journal, they all say that air traffic control unions will oppose this change. Wrong. They have been calling for this change. What they do say is, let us be involved in its development, because you've got a 15% shortfall in the number of people. You're going to have to hire another 15% just for this transition, the 15 years of which you spoke. That's a 30% shortfall. Nobody's going to lose their jobs when you've got a 30% shortfall. 10% are going to retire in the next 2 years anyway. But involve them in the change. They're asking for that. Or it can be simply top down and say, without reference to the people who are going to be using the change, this is how you're going to do it, and you will find resistance. That's a human factor. That has nothing to do with trade unionism.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a positive sell there from the ILO. Hope he's persuaded some of you. I'd like to ask Klaus Bauer about working across borders. You do a lot of work in China, Bombardier Transport. You're building high-speed trains there. You're also building metro underground trains there. Some of them are actually manufactured in China, right? Not just in Germany. Give us an insight on the human factor when it comes to cross-border developments.
Yeah, that is not a very easy question. We are a large organization, Bombardier worldwide. We have organized ourselves in division. That means we have responsible people for high speed all over the world. We have responsible people for metro all over the world. And if we have a product like a new high-speed train for China, which we will produce in China, we have a development team which is located in different sites. What we need there is a real good connection via internet to exchange information, via video conferences. But of course, the factor to really see the people and visit the people is also important. So you need a mix of traveling and meeting each other personally and having the new media to really exchange data very quickly and to use video conferences, internet, whatever. So it is a not easy process, and it takes a time to really achieve good results, because it's different cultures you meet, it's different language you address, it's also the norms and standards are different. So people coming from different nations or different countries have to adapt to the final product and final standards. And so it's a very...
But you put it very succinctly for us. Thank you very much, Klaus Bauer. And I'd like to pick up that idea of new technologies, Web 2.0 technologies, the internet, the way in which we can share information across borders. How important do you think it is, panel, in terms of disseminating innovation and making sure that in this area of transport we can try and move things? Does anyone want to pick up that question? Mr. Bauer does.
If not, I could give an example. For example, we have built the new metro for New Delhi. And in parallel, the first cars were built in Germany, but in parallel we have built up a factory in India. And to get this factory started, we have a big training program where we really brought all the people from India to Germany to work in the factory where the cars were built, and then transferred them to the factory in India. That was a real, very interesting process and a successful process.
Okay, and a nice insight into the human factor.
But in the end, it boils down, in my opinion, my experience, to the people. You have to find the right people who go somewhere and don't try to export, I would call it a German attitude. They have to be culturally open. When they go to Indonesia, when they would go to Russia, to China, it's not that we come to conquer and present something. It's something also to learn. And for that attitude, to find the appropriate people who are willing to go there, not only for half a year, it's not a vacation. It's a long-term commitment, because in the end it boils down to personal relations, how people can deal with each other. Long, trustful relations.
Okay. Can I just bring in Minister Wang there? I can see that you're nodding your head. I know you've had experience working extensively in Mexico in the 1990s. There's a lot of foreign suppliers in China. Can you give us your insight on how people interact, bring their skills, but also their openness, as we just heard from Karsten from Toll Collect?
我非常赞同刚才两位先生、企业界先生的这个观点，因为创新的动力啊，创新是靠人去创造的，所以激发人的创造能力、创造性非常重要。所以我觉得这两个公司，包括德国公司、庞巴迪公司，能够在中国合作成功的话，其原因就是像他董事会主席说的，就是很好的激发了中国员工的这种创造能力和积极性。按照我过去的经验和体会呢，我觉得不同民族、不同国家之间的人之间的沟通理解非常重要。一个外国公司、跨国公司，你要在全球发展，一定要融入到当地。你在当地的公司要尽可能做到本地化，这就非常重要。在注重国际化的同时，你要本地化。当然，我不是说本地化把国际化不要了， 我觉得两者之间能够做到比较融洽的结合，这就是成功之处，这是我的体会。
Very interesting point. I would like to bring the audience in at this stage of our discussion. We've had a number of different issues raised here. We've been talking about standards. We've been talking about public-private partnership. We've been talking about the human factor. And you can bring in other subjects too. I have got one mic here, and there are more mics roving around. So please put your hand up and tell us who you are, and if there's someone in particular that you want to ask your question to, or whether it's a general one. Is there a questioner at the back? Here you go. So, stand up.
Hello, I'm from the International Chamber of Shipping, and we're the International Trade Association for Merchant Ship Operators. I just really had a comment about standards. I think we're very fortunate in shipping in that we actually do genuinely have a global system of standards provided through us through the United Nations International Maritime Organization. But one point I'd want to make is that now, with regard to innovation, the emphasis now with the regulators at the IMO is very much about goal-based standards. So you set a broad objective in terms of safety or environmental performance, but you're not over-prescriptive, so you can leave the details of how you actually achieve the new standard, which may be aspirational, to the industry itself. And just one extra point, we have a conflict now in that increasingly we're under pressure to meet environmental standards, and this is a question for the Minister from China. In shipping, we have a tradition of global regulation for global industry, but how do we reconcile that with the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibility?
Minister Wang, that's a question directly for you.
这是非常好的问题，这个也是我们面临的一个难题啊。因为诸位先生也知道，中国政府呢对环保问题非常重视啊。当然，同时中国又是个发展中的国家，我们的发展水平比较低，包括海运方面，在海运的环保，包括相关的排放方面，我们在有些领域还有一定的差距。但是我想，这些标准不是就像这个我们爬楼梯上这个楼一样，都需要个过程。但是我最终是要上楼梯，我一定会爬到5楼去。但是呢，这个过程呢，我不能跳上去啊，哪怕坐电梯，我的一层楼一层楼上去，却不要说我在走楼梯。但我觉得应该尽快的缩短这个过程，这是对的啊。在这个标准问题上，我们是认同，而且应该认为要加快步伐来推进。这个就涉及到不同发展国家的水平的问题。这是我的回答。
So, please, Minister Levitin.
Действительно хороший вопрос. Каждая страна развивается по своему циклу и по своему историческому периоду. Нельзя сказать, что завтра с 1 июня вот должно быть у всех одинаково. Это будет некорректно к развивающимся странам, потому что они проходят свой цикл развития. Но страны эти должны руководствоваться общими конвенционными регламентами. Но цикл выхода каждой страны должен быть разный, он не может быть одинаковым. В противном случае те страны, которые сегодня не достигли уровня развитых стран, должны сказать: вы теперь будете страной 3-4 сорта, а мы будем развитыми. Поэтому здесь очень важно понимать страну, куда ты приходишь со своими идеями и инновациями. Я хотел сказать, что у нас есть 2 вида транспорта, которые регулируется международными организациями. Гражданская авиация и морской флот. У нас есть общие конвенции, общие требования. Автомобильный транспорт, железнодорожный транспорт живут по законам своих стран. Вот это неправильно. Нам надо создавать глобальную железнодорожную организацию, такая же нужна на автомобильном транспорте. И тогда страна, вступая в эту организацию, должна следовать ее рекомендациям. В противном случае мы не можем ей предъявлять претензии. Почему вы делаете так или по-другому? Мне кажется, что эта тема очень важная.
Excellent. I have another question here from Professor Sundar, who comes from the Energy and Research Institute in India. And I have a funny feeling it's going to be about standards.
Thank you, Nisha. I'd like to support Minister Leviton's intervention when he said that just as in the case of the aviation industry and shipping industry, there is perhaps need for an institution, a need for globalization of certain standards in the other transport modes. I'd like to argue that in respect of certain parameters like safety, for instance, or emissions, there ought to be global standards. I mean, after all, if the automobile manufacturers, some 12 or 15 of them make automobiles all over the world, in the West, as in China, as in India, the auto majors, and if they feel that a certain intervention or an invention is important from a safety point of view, and they provide it in Europe because more stringent regulations require those to be provided, they equally ought to have the responsibility to provide them in the developing world. So I'm not talking about how a dashboard is fitted or how the upholstery is done. These need not be harmonized. But things like safety, emission, CO2 reduction, in respect of these areas, standards ought to be standardized. And if an institution is necessary for that purpose, I think we need to create that institution. I'd just like to add one more point.
Go on, Professor Sundar.
The discussion so far has been largely on public-private partnership and the human factor in bringing about innovations. I think governments must also recognize that they have a major role in creating the market through fiscal incentives for inventions to enter those countries. That is what happened in the case of mobile phones. And that is what will make electric vehicles available in most countries of the world, creating a congenial market for electric vehicles to come, and for governments investing in infrastructure for charging stations and the like to make this happen. So I think government, in addition to public-private partnership, have a major role in creating markets for innovation. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Sundar. Anyone want to respond to that? Marc Jouel?
Yes, maybe. Thanks, Nisha. Yes, well, first I'd like to second what the professor just said, and that's part actually of the work of the bank, working with our client countries to help them develop policies which will lay the ground for making it easier for innovations to reach those countries, actually, in particular with all market-driven innovations. Now, of course, it's one necessary thing to do, but when we are working in countries with very thin markets, very low purchasing power, you still may find it difficult just to leave it to the natural market forces to play and make things happen. That's where you'll need some additional incentives or additional level of partnerships where the public sector that the bank would help would take additional burden at the start to jumpstart or prime the pump, basically, to get the new process going.
So what do you mean by that? Give us an example.
Well, that could be just to introducing, for instance, a new technology in transport, urban transport, for instance. When you are in cities who are clearly in need of new urban transport systems, but where they are not at a point where it would be easy to bring a private operator under a regular kind of PPP scheme to come and operate a new line of bus or even a bus rapid transit system. You may need a different kind of balance at the start of in the commitments of the public sector, of the municipality, and the commitments the private sector is willing to take. It might become even more true when we come to new technology, new vehicles in the future. Let's assume and let's hope indeed that car manufacturers will come up sooner than later with those vehicles, low carbon vehicles. or no carbon vehicles, electric fuel cells, whatever. Now, how do we manage to get those vehicles to spread? I mean, within the developed world, let's say, we can expect market forces to play and indeed those replacements to take place. Now, in the developing world, especially in the low developed countries, if we wait for the natural market forces, it may take much too long a time for this to happen. And the bank and other development institutions may have to help facilitate the introduction of these new technologies. For instance, helping the public sector create the infrastructure to support them, because it's one nice thing to have an electric car. You still have to make sure the power grid in the country is able actually to power those new cars, assuming that people can buy them. Or if you have fuel cells, well, you have to have a network in order to distribute hydrogen, which is again not a given thing today in California, where we do have indeed already some fuel cell vehicle being sold by as last time I checked a few months ago, you just have two service stations being able to provide hydrogen. Okay. So that's questions where we need some kind of public support at the beginning to create the conditions where a market can actually unfold and help this innovation to spread.
Get your point. I think Karsten Kirchmann wants to
Two more comments from my side. On the one side, I think the funding situation of all public sectors, of the governments, will strengthen the PPP project. There will be the need, because you will come into discussions. I take it for Germany. It's more sexy to invest in kindergarten or education than, for example, to pump money in infrastructure. And then you have to make a decision where to put the money, and if you don't have the money for infrastructure, where else do you get it from? One thing I think we have left out of the discussion so far, which I think is key, at least here in this country with respect to the transport sector, it's the opinion of the public. Because when the public always has received something which they have paid indirectly via taxes, why the heck should I now suddenly pay for something I have already paid for? So we have to keep in mind, that's nicely talked about, we have to convince the public that certain things certainly need to be privatized, and that there has to be an acceptability and a willingness to take that path.
So you need to get your ideas out of holes like this into the real world. We've got a questioner at the back.
I'm Yoshi Hayashi from Nagoya University, Japan. I'm very happy here because you have talked about how to help developing countries. So far in this conference, not much talked about. Regarding Kyoto mechanism, CDM has not been well accepted in the field of transport. As I mentioned in the previous
the Clean Development Mechanism.
Yeah. Already more than 2,000 schemes have been approved by the UN, but only 3 schemes were approved in transport. So quite lacking the number of schemes. And for that we have to make effort to push UN the change criteria to accept the projects of transport. They are requesting very exact amount of CO2 reduced. It's impossible in the case of transport. The next is ODA. ODA's total amount is 1 order or more higher than CDM. Many ODA projects are encouraging to increase CO2 emissions. Typically, in many cases, constructing too many roads compared to railways. So when doing ODA, each developed country should check whether it is a green ODA or not. So
I'm going to ask the panel to come in there and give you a response.
Yes.
We've got a question on the Clean Development Mechanism,
so,
also
if
on
you have
overseas
any
development aid.
opinions.
Who wants to jump in there?
Okay, I believe I have to jump in first, obviously, but please follow. CDM, yeah. It's quite true that the way the CDM has been devised has not been conducive to many transport operations being taken up, but you're right, 3 out of more than 1,000, due to the fact that the methodology which are required actually to qualify for CDM are extremely demanding, and as you said, it's quite difficult to meet those requirements. However, the CDM is a custodian of it, which is a climate technology funds, which is a significant facility in terms of money made available. And within the CTF, we can indeed use CTF for transport, and actually not only the bank, of course, all countries, all development banks can use the CTF, but within the World Bank itself, we have already brought 3 projects just within the next 6 months to the CTF board of urban transport operations, actually in Mexico, in Turkey, and in Egypt.
So maybe that will partly.
So that would help. I believe the CTF operation will certainly be much more conducive than the CDM in helping transport get to a low carbon solution. On the road rail.
Mark, I'm going to bring someone else in. Okay.
With that.
George, do you want to make an intervention at this point?
No, I'll pass on to that. I just wanted to say, I hope everybody knows that ODA is official development assistance, because if they're not in the development world, you don't know those things, and that's organizations like Mark's and from governments as well. Sometimes those of us in the development world throw around acronyms, and others don't know it in the same way from your transportation circle. I don't know yours.
Thank you. So sometimes you don't know where your assistance is going to come from, but that was very timely from my point of view, certainly. Do we have another question?
Thank you, Nisha. It's for Igor Levitin and Wang Mengyong. It's about, by the way, my name is Hanns-Karsten, International Association of Public Transport. It's about this international standards. You're calling for international institutions driving standardizations. When I'm listening to presentations in China on buses, it's very interesting to hear that there is one word which is not translated into Chinese, and that is euro. If it's all about diesel engines, euro 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 appear in your language. It's in Russian, it's the same. So are you calling for standards which exist already? How far Western standards, if I might call them, are appropriate for you? And would it be possible to extend on that? Thank you.
Minister Levitin.
Да, у нас есть программа перевода нашего транспорта на стандарты Евро-4 и Евро-5. Но мы не можем перейти одновременно на такие стандарты, потому что нам необходима модернизация нефтеперерабатывающих заводов. Они должны производить топливо, соответствующее этим стандартам. Если мы введем сегодня эти стандарты, мы должны будем ввозить топливо из-за рубежа. Тогда получается, что мы нефть отдаем соседям, а соседи обратно нам топливо Евро-4, Евро-5. Я думаю, что это нецелесообразно. Поэтому у нас есть программа. В 2012 году наш транспорт будет обязан иметь нижний порог Евро-3 и Евро-4-5. Вот наша программа до 2012 года.
是的，这位先生刚刚提的这个问题啊，现在在中国的许多大城市，比如像北京，公共交通当中都采用了欧4甚至更高的标准。当然，这个问题正像我前面说到的，反正一个好的标准，它能够给我们的环境、给我们的经济带来发展动力的，我们肯定都能接受，对吧？当然，有些标准呢，比如可能设置的高。我们暂时还有个发展的过程，对吧？但并不是说我排斥它，只不过是我实现这个标准有一定的时间线。正如刚才俄罗斯列维金部长说得很好，这是一个发展阶段的问题。其实作为发展中国家，像中国来说， 我们特别是在一些绿色发展技术、环保、低碳技术方面，我们是致力于在推进努力实现这些目标的。谢谢。
So a similar answer there, really, to you from Minister Levitin and Vice Minister Wang. Anyone else want to ask a question of our distinguished panel? Hands at the back? Well, I have a question to ask you, which might be a very nice way of rounding up our discussion. And that is, can you imagine that I am a very powerful being, and in my hand I have a magic wand. And when I wave my wand, I can grant you any wish, one wish. What would your wish be to transform your particular industry or your particular area of responsibility in terms of the context of our discussion, disseminating innovation, getting ideas moving? And I'm going to ask Minister Levitin that first, because he's got a big smile on his face.
Вы знаете, что у России есть одна большая проблема – это дороги. Можете махнуть палочкой. Если у нас будут хорошие дороги, я вам буду благодарен.
That's a great answer, and very short. Unfortunately, there's no one here I can put you together with, Minister Levitin. I am, however, going to ask Klaus Bauer from Bombardier Transport, what would your big wish be, briefly?
I would be very happy if we would have a homologation for trains which can run all over Europe, and just one authority to get this homologation.
It sounds like a great dream, and I think Bombardier would really benefit from it as well. Minister Wang.
我的愿望是希望通过创新能使我们未来我们国家的交通运输系统更安全、更清洁、更高效。就此。
So you're on the side of the angels there, Vice Minister Wang. Thank you. Rafael Gallego, if I were to grant you one wish to try and shake up your industry.
Okay. Technology is, by its own nature, is global. So my wish should be that this globalization be effective to all people in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafael. And since the yellow mic is in operation, George.
Thanks. I don't have a particular industry, but obviously from what you heard me say earlier, my one wish is that we remain open to where innovation can come from, and it's just not all top-down, but from the bottom as well, and that there are many different ideas from many different places, and we remain open to the different sources of innovation.
Yes, I'm sure there are many heads nodding at that point. Mark Schuel.
Well, actually, I'd like, before giving you my wish, to pick up on that. I wanted to add a perspective that we didn't raise that much, is that innovation also comes from the developing world. And there are some very striking examples. I mean, microfinance came out of Bangladesh. And it's up after the Grameen Bank experience, and all development institutions scrambled to actually put in place microfinance programs. In urban transport, South American cities like Curitiba and Bogota have been pioneers in developing top-of-the-league bus rapid transit systems, to the extent that when we are asked by some country, like recently South Africa, to help them develop BRT, we don't fly them to Paris or London or Berlin, we fly them to South America. And hopefully in a few years from now, when Central Asian countries are already actually looking into that, we'll ask us the same question. We fly them to Johannesburg and Cape Town. There is this South-South cooperation, which is key. Or the simple thing also, not only South-South, but sometimes an innovation is developed. I'm thinking of Singapore, who actually 15 years ago developed a very performing system of connecting port community systems, connecting all actors in the port, the trade. Singapore sold this system in Tunisia, but later on Tunisia spread this system throughout several African countries, and we did finance in the banks those operations. They are much better received when they come from a country coming from the same region. So there is a huge potential in the South-South development of innovation, and we shouldn't forget that, yes, indeed, innovation doesn't always come from a place where it's supposed to come from. It comes from everywhere. And my wish, if you will listen, my wish, I mean, the bank transport strategy says safe, clean, affordable transport. I'd like transport to become safer, cleaner, and more affordable for all as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to give the last word to Karsten because he is an innovator and his business is hugely innovative.
Before I tell you my wish, let me reiterate one thing. We have had the pleasure of meeting you via lunch. You are a very powerful lady indeed. Let you just reassure that one. My wish is pretty simple. Satellite tolling worldwide with a high public acceptability. Acceptance, that's the right word. Thank you.
Brilliant. What an amazing panel we've had. Please put your hands together and thank our eminent and eloquent guests. Minister Levitin, Transport Secretary from Russia, Vice Minister Wang from China, Karsten Kirchmann, who's created this whole new industry, Toll Collect. Who knows where it'll spread to? From Bombardier Transport, Klaus Bauer, who has been doing enormous business in China and elsewhere in the world. Marc Jouel from the World Bank, who's been inspiring us with stories, success stories. Rafael Gallego from Indra from Spain, last but not least, helping us understand things a bit more clearly. Thank you, George Dragnich from the ILO. Thank you for making a great audience.